Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CFA Society Chicago's Distinguished Speaker Series event with Ted Merz, head of Bloomberg News. Thanks for making the time today to join us in a unique opportunity to hear from a fellow CFA and a member of CFA New York. I'm Chris Vincent, President and CEO of the Society. Today's event is being recorded. All attendees' mics will be muted during the event. If you have a question for our speaker, please use the Q&A feature. For info on our upcoming events, please visit our website at cfachicago.org. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ted Merz, Global Head of News Product at Bloomberg. Ted oversees search and display for news and social media content on the Bloomberg Professional Terminal. He's also responsible for news analytics and third-party content deals. His tenure at Bloomberg spans 3 decades, with the first 17 years as a journalist. As product head, he started First Word, which some of you may know is a news summarization service. He also founded Bloomberg Brief newsletters, which are research-driven periodicals on topics spanning PE, hedge funds, economics, and other relevant topics. Ted was also responsible for integrating Twitter to their professional platform. As a journalist, Ted started the company's emerging markets coverage in 1991. He spent a time running the New York bureau, and he oversaw global fixed income and general coverage for the Americas. Given this resume, I'm reasonably sure we should have no shortage of questions for Ted. The format today is for Ted to speak and then handle some audience Q&A. Ted, on behalf of CFA Society Chicago's 5,000 members and the oldest investment analyst society or club in the CFA Institute network, thanks for making the time to join us today, and welcome.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chris. And it is a pleasure to be here today. I will tell you that taking the CFA test and passing was probably the hardest thing I did professionally. So being able to be here and speak to you all is just a real honor. I want to share my screen and get going here. So tell me if you can all see that. Great. So as Chris mentioned, I have been at Bloomberg 30 years. I spent the first 17 in the editorial group, and then the last 13 in the product group. And so I am going to be talking today about the news product and the news year we've had, because it's very exciting, because we've never seen a year in my professional career that's anything like 2020. And I want to set the stage first with a chart. And I think this chart explains a lot of what's happening. So what we're looking at here is the news volume of coverage of the 3 biggest stories that occurred in the Americas this year. The blue line is indicative of the volume of daily coverage about COVID-19. The orange line is about the election, and the white is about the protests that we experienced, especially Black Lives Matter in the middle of the year. The scale is in millions, and this includes 175,000 sources that appear on Bloomberg's platform in 40 languages. So it's a very big cohort. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that for the coverage of elections and protests, they follow an arc that is familiar to us for most news events. That is to say, they are short, sharp spikes. That's what we call it a news cycle. Things come and things go. COVID is an exception to this rule. It is massive, it's sustained, it's wide-reaching, and it's global. If we thought the election was significant, I mean, just look at the chart of how much more coverage there was about COVID relative to that in the election. It's a way to, I find that the news volume about events, which is a fairly new capability we have, is a great way to measure engagement when there is no sort of traditional fundamental number. At the height of the coverage of COVID, which was in March and April, there were almost 400,000 stories running on Bloomberg every day about that topic. And that's equivalent to about 30% of the global news coverage about an event, which given the long tail of all the things that journalists write about, is truly unbelievable. I mean, the economic crisis in 2008 was a really big story. 9/11 was obviously a massive story, but this is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like it. I'm going to walk you through sort of some of the dynamics about the coverage and what it tells us about the financial business and financial information today. And I'll talk for about 35 minutes or so and then take questions. If you do have questions along the way, feel free to use the screen on Zoom where you have the question at the bottom, and go ahead and put them in now if you want, and I'll get to them when we end this part of the presentation. So I want to start with a question. And the question is, where were you when you first heard about COVID? And it seems like a crazy question, but you know, the biggest events that occurred in history, people tend to remember. They remember, and they'll tell you where they were when JFK was shot. They'll tell you when they heard about Princess Diana. They obviously know when they were when they saw the towers collapse in 9/11. What's interesting about COVID is people tend not to know that. They don't know, and there's a reason they don't know, because the story kind of emerged slower. It didn't erupt the way typically a huge story did. And so I want to unspool that, solve that mystery a little bit, and do a little bit of detective work, and show you how I came to some answers about that. So we know that the virus started in Wuhan, China, but we don't really know, or I didn't know, when it broke exactly and how quickly it evolved. And I think we're going to learn some valuable lessons from this investigation. So I started off on Bloomberg doing a search. I did a news search for all our sources in all our languages. So that's 40 languages, 175,000 sources. And I searched for any story that had the word Wuhan in it with English characters, but also Chinese characters, because I thought it might have emerged first in Chinese. I used a feature that Bloomberg has embedded in it, which is machine translation. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, to render the results in English so I could easily see them. And I had to toggle around and page a lot, but eventually I came to an answer. And the answer is incredible. December 30th, when I was in Hawaii on vacation, at 9:19 p.m., that's when the first story appeared about COVID. It was in Chinese, which was December 31st, 9:19 in Beijing time. And so that explains maybe a little bit of why people didn't focus on it right away, because we were many of us were on holiday. But what's interesting, if you drill into that story, this is the English translation of the China Business News story, which is ground zero for COVID news coverage. And it says, Wuhan unexplained pneumonia has been isolated and test results will be announced immediately. So one of the things that's interesting about this is, and one of the reasons I'm pretty sure this is the first coverage, is that other media descended upon this story. So Bloomberg editors, within 5 minutes, took that story, translated it with machine translation, and pushed this out to clients. So the English-speaking financial world would have been able to view, if they were looking at normal Bloomberg stories about illnesses or health or China, they would have been able to read this. And a couple takeaways right away, you see the machine translation is shockingly good. I mean, it's not perfect, but you pretty much have an idea that something's going on. One of the reasons they knew to do this was because the reporter who covered it, the editor, had been covering SARS 2 decades earlier. They covered the bird flu. They knew that when you have this kind of thing in China, it's a big deal. So that was interesting. And as I delved through the record, Bloomberg published a story about 90 minutes later, our first kind of story about this. And then at the end of the day, we did a full-on story. So about 5 hours after that first story, the headline is, China probes cluster of mystery pneumonia cases amid SARS fears. So it's pretty interesting, like, you know, when this came out, it wasn't like people didn't know. I mean, it was covered. And in fact, in the days that followed, Bloomberg did 12 stories, a dozen stories related to this outbreak. And there was an occurrence in Hong Kong. There was a false occurrence in Singapore. The reporters called the WHO for comment. There was a comparison with SARS. So there was a fair amount of inquiry. On the 6th of January, the New York Times published a story, and on the 8th of January, the Washington Post. So this was well covered in China, but even general interest major publications in the US covered it within the first week. So it was definitely out there. Now, what do I take away from this? So there's a few things that you should think about in terms of when you think about information and the information business. The first is that the story broke in the mainstream media. So we're going to talk a lot about social media, but most major stories break in the traditional media, and that's still the case. Social media often amplifies them, it draws your attention to it, but it's not where they originate. The coverage is fast and thorough. The news spread globally pretty quickly. The story started with a whimper, not a bang. That's because, it wasn't 9/11. And the significance was not immediately obvious to many. And in part, that's because there's so much volume these days, it's hard to find what's important. And I'm going to be talking about that too. What is interesting though, again, it's when you say people didn't know, it's not true that no one knew. And one of the interesting stories that came out of this was the grocery chain in Texas based in San Antonio, H-E-B. For all of you who've been down to Texas, is kind of a cultural icon. They knew. They had supply chain in China, and they read the press. And the reason they knew also, they had a disaster team that was really set up to handle hurricanes, but they monitored these kinds of situations. So by the second week in January, they had started to implement their process, and they had modeled out what would happen to Houston if the virus came to Houston, which it did a month later. So I think it's an interesting thing to remember that sort of the way information spreads, and this has a lot of implications for financial professionals. It oftentimes very significant things occur that you can't appreciate at the time. And that's a lot of what we're trying to think about, is how to understand what's important. Just to drive that point home, again, if the story broke at the end of December, it was negligible until the 20th or so of January. And then it kind of ramped up. And as you recall, President Trump implemented a travel ban from China at the very end of January. Another fascinating thing is, if you look at the coverage arc, the biggest story in our lifetime, the coverage declined after that travel ban. Now it's going to spike, but the first 3 weeks in February, it declined. Now, why did it decline? It declined because there were two other things going on. There was the impeachment of the president, and there was the Iowa caucus, and all the concern about who's going to run on the Democratic ticket. And the lesson there, and thing to remember, is that news coverage and information flow is a bit of a zero-sum game. So if reporters are covering the election, they can't cover Corona at the same time, or minimally. You can't really move the needle there. So it's an important thing to remember that sometimes some of these flows give you an indication of where engagement is and interest is, but sometimes they're a reflection of the fact that you can't cover everything at the same time. So I want to talk about kind of, for me, what this drove home. And I think that when I looked at the Corona story, it reinforced for me that basically the way we get information, the way it flows, is not changed dramatically, but it has accelerated some of the trends that we've been looking at for a few years now. And the 5 big trends, and I will unpack each one. The first is the availability of content. So that is, how can I get to that content if it's in Chinese or if it's in other countries? Just the being able to access not just Bloomberg content, but lots of content. The second is machine translation, which is really a big, big deal because it allows you to unlock content you couldn't have read before. The third are news analytics. News analytics basically are things like where you can get insight out of content. A good example is the news flow of the virus story. Summarization. The increase in volume is causing a need for tools that allow you to distill down information and have quick takeaways. Finally, news automation. So news automation is a way to, in the way Bloomberg deploys it, discover data sets and discover information that's relevant at a specific time. So I want to walk through some of these and start with the availability of content. It's worth understanding this. When I started in this position, Bloomberg carried maybe 10,000 stories a day. we had really a handful of sources. So we now carry 175,000 sources, all hand selected, and we run 1.5 million stories. So it's just exponentially large. If you look at the chart, you'll see that the march up is steady and relentless. And it's relentless because we continue to add websites we scrape, content deals we do with publications like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and others, especially news sources and social media. We did a deal with Twitter. We've done deals with Facebook, YouTube, Weibo. So all that content, which is quite voluminous. Our view on it is that financial professionals need to be able to access that to be able to find out what's going on. So first, to get in the game, you need to be able to get to the content. So the content, I want to talk a minute about social, because social is quite interesting. And we did a deal with Twitter a number of years ago. And I think many people don't quite understand what's going on there. So oftentimes people look at Twitter and they think it is a place where people post photographs and they post what I ate for breakfast and so forth. And that's all true. There are 500 million tweets a day. Of that 500 million, we estimate that about 1% or 500,000 are financially relevant in the broadest sense. So they're about oil, or they're about earnings, or they're about a company or an organization or a government. Within that 500,000 on a given day, maybe 50,000 are actually interesting. Of those 50,000, maybe 50 are breaking news, and 5 are seriously market moving. So you can see that this is really a needle in the haystack kind of stuff. I used an example here to illustrate kind of what the opportunity and challenge is on Twitter. So we had the news story last week of the assassination of an Iranian nuclear scientist. The New York Times coverage, in their coverage, they quoted one of the commanders in the Revolutionary Guards, but they quoted him from Twitter. He tweeted about this. And I'll tell you, I never get tired of the fact how amazing it is that the Revolutionary Guard respond to news events on Twitter. Now, they respond in Farsi, of course, so you have to read Farsi or translate it, and you have to know who they are. So this person has about 2,400 followers, which is not, big deal. You really have to know who he is. But having said that, once you do know, you can get some amazing stuff. This is an example I found yesterday that I had to share because it's so damn interesting. And I think it shows something about where CFA professionals need to be thinking. When I took the exam, we really focused on fundamental cash flow analysis and so forth. And that's all undoubtedly important. But this is amazing to me. So this woman, Terry Nelson, puts out a tweet. She's reading Amazon reviews of Yankee Candle because it's the holidays and that's when you buy Yankee Candle. And she sees in the reviews that people are complaining that they don't have any scent, like the scented candles have no scent. And, she just notes that. She's just a person, But what's amazing is this woman, Kate Petrova, who's 22 years old and graduated from Bryn Mawr in April and is kind of a data visualization person, read it, and she tapped into the API on Amazon. She downloaded all the reviews about Yankee Candles. She built a script where she extracted and counted the number of reviews on Amazon where they mentioned the lack of scent in candles. And she charted them historically for 3 years. So she clearly has too much time on her hands, but you can see that there's a jump. And so what's amazing about this is that this results in a news story 2 days later in The Independent and in a bunch of other publications. And so obviously the company, I'm sure, had no idea this was coming. Their PR office is getting called. And, if you're a professional analyzing the company, which is owned by Newell Brands, you're like, this is coming out of left field. So it's kind of an example of how you have to keep track of this stuff. Now, finding this is really difficult, but it gives you a chance of, I think, the opportunity that's available to do financial analysis on these new data sets, these new large volumes of information. Just 2 more I'd mention. We have StockTwits is a community where they share, sort of day traders share lots of information. We've had that carried down Bloomberg for some time. And then Reddit, we don't carry, but we're talking about doing that. Reddit is incredible amounts of information, but it's like a giant warehouse where you don't know where anything is. I mean, good luck finding it. So the challenge there is if we could find the important information and then put it at your fingertips, it then allows financial professionals to do the hard work of understanding like what it means. And so like that's kind of a reoccurring theme for this talk. Getting the information is the first hard part, given the volume, but then it's really up to you all to understand what that means. The second big area I want to talk about is machine translation. And I think this is probably one of the least appreciated trends. And to understand it, you want to take a step back. When I grew up, I read the New York Times. That's because I lived in the New York metro area. Now, I think nothing of reading the Washington Post and Politico and Twitter and lots of sources. But I'll tell you what I don't read. I don't read Interfax in Russian. I don't read Le Monde in French. I don't read El País in Spanish. Now, do I think those publications have great journalists? Yeah. Do I think they break news? Yeah. Do I think Le Monde is probably a better source for news about French companies than the New York Times? 100%. What machine translation does is it allows you to start to unlock that and be able to translate it. So this, the first example I used was some breaking news from Brazil from a year ago, where the president tweeted about a change in the tax agency. And so Trump is not the only president who tweets. You've got to follow other people. But the ability to know that in real time is really game changing. And so what we're working on at Bloomberg, we have right now a large scale capability of translating on demand. The game changer really is translating in real time. And we're doing that on a small selection of our content now. So on this chart, what you see or on this screen is you can set up a real-time feed for news about North American equities. You can change your default and automatically stream that into one of 10 other languages. So in this case, I put it into Spanish. So if you cannot dominate English, if you are, and you can stream it into your own language, it opens up the world. And obviously where we want to go with that is to do that the other way too, where you're able to read important stories from Interfax, maybe about oil or industries that are important in Russia, and read them in real time in English. Right now, that's sort of something that most people don't think about. In our system, about 40% of the content on Bloomberg is not in English. So you think about that, there's a whole world of content that people are going to have access to, and it's going to make, in a sense, your job both give you greater opportunity, but make it more challenging too to find all that. The third big area and trend we're looking at is news analytics. So what are news analytics? I think of them as ways to leverage content sets and discover insight. The two building blocks we have are counting the number of news stories and assessing a sentiment score to them. So when we talk about counting, I showed you earlier the chart that showed the volume of the coverage of COVID, and I showed you how you could draw some conclusions from that. You can do that with companies as well, and it's quite insightful. So in the case of Boeing, if you look at this chart and I were to ask you, when did the 737 MAX crash? What do you think you'd say? I mean, it just jumps out at you, right? So what we see here is an opportunity to go beyond the traditional financial indicators of like volume and price to give people understanding about important events. There are very important events that occur for companies where the price doesn't move, where volume doesn't move, because people are still thinking about how to think about it. So what the counting of news stories does is it provides another metric, another way of looking at engagement by investors or importance. And looking at this chart, what I love is that not only did the story spike on that day, that traditional news event, but they remain elevated for another year. I mean, while Boeing was investigated and they were, they went before Congress and all sorts of things. So you can really see that what it tells you is that that event is not over for that company. It's still going on. We also look at sentiment. So what sentiment does is we've built proprietary algorithms that read the news stories, and they assess the story as being positive or negative based on various linguistic aspects. So take a look at Boeing. Again, if I asked you when the crash occurred, you'd be like, you can just see it on the chart. Boeing had probably a very happy public relations department right up until March, and then since then, the majority of the coverage has been basically negative or critical. So this is not, doesn't necessarily mean the stock price will go up or down, but it's another tool to try to measure and understand how people are thinking about companies. When you use these, you can do lots of other things kind of based on these two basic building blocks. And I'm going to show you just some examples I've done in the past. So I looked at Zoom earlier this year. Zoom was skyrocketing in price. And I charted the news stories against the stock price. And you can see basically investors in February, March, April, they were all over that. They figured out that this was a place to be. The media kind of figured it out in early April. So, whether you conclude here that the interest by the media will drive prices higher, or you conclude that journalists are just late to the party, is really, your call. But what's interesting about it is it gives you some sense of the fact that, I would read this chart to say that a lot more people are going to learn about Zoom than knew about it before. So maybe there's more opportunity. Certainly my parents are in that camp. I took a data set that I found interesting. Bloomberg editors send out headlines when things are very important. So they send out a few a day. And one of the things that you see here is that over 15 years, there's kind of a baseline in coverage. And you can see how much bigger the COVID story was, how many more headlines they sent that they marked hot or very important, urgent. And I think what this does for me is it's another way of understanding that there's a lot of data embedded and insight embedded in news, because you're able to quantify things in ways that perhaps were not quantifiable before. And I'm going to show you one more fun chart I did. I was looking for a way to try to come up with a key man risk indicator. And so the idea I had was, what if I looked at all the news articles about big benchmark companies, and then I looked at how many of them mentioned the CEO in the article. And so, not surprisingly, Berkshire mentions Warren Buffett 60% of the time for that time period I looked at. This was a year or so ago. So at that time, WeWork was a hot company. Adam Newman was on the top of the hill, and he was in 40% of the articles. He was a founder, not surprising. But when you take a whole cohort of this, you can see over time that the average works out to be about 9%. So 9% of the S&P 500, or I'm sorry, of the S&P 500, when you look at stories about an individual company, about 9% of the time the CEO is mentioned. And whether that's good or bad, you can make the call. But certainly it's interesting when it diverges from that average. Okay, the fourth big trend I want to talk about is summarization. So summarization is very important, again, coming back to because the volume of coverage that we're looking at. And so what we've built is a new summarization engine that has two important pieces of technology, and this is proprietary to Bloomberg. What we do is we take a news search, and we first determine are stories similar. And then we have the computer using an AI program write a label for those to try to group them together. So the way that plays out is if you look at this screen, on the bottom, you have a traditional flow of news headlines, and they're coming in chronologically. And I have them set, I think I have English as well as Spanish and other languages set up, but they're just flowing in about Pfizer. And on the top, I have a component that summarizes those articles. So in the case of Pfizer, and I think I took this yesterday, there were 248 articles on that day. The largest cluster was 48. And you can see that was the computer used an AI program to write the label UK to approve Pfizer vaccine. So you can see the utility of this, because what it allows you to do is add a snapshot, sort of get a summary, a very informational, basic summary that says this is what you need to know about a company, about a country, a topic, or any topic you're looking at. We can alter the time periods and so forth. So we think this is very important technology because a lot of the jobs for people in the financial markets are oftentimes basically just synthesizing information and telling other people what's going on. Your portfolio manager will call you and saying, you know, what's happening in this name, what's happening in this country, and you need to be able to say, okay, Pfizer just got approval for this vaccine. Boom. You know, they're not looking for a traditional news headline. They're looking for something very basic and simple. So I'll give you a couple other examples of that. I looked at, I think this was on Sunday, and I looked at the news flow on the coronavirus. So at that point, there were 24,000 articles about corona. And these were the 5 biggest clusters of stories. And you can see that the way the program is designed to work is grouping them, ranking them, and then quickly giving you a summary so you know what it says. This is definitely a work in progress. We still need to improve some of the AI, but it is so useful. And given the enormity of coping with such huge volumes, we think it's really an essential tool. We've built this and integrated this into some of our screens. This is an example of companies in the S&P 500 ranked by the number of stories. And on the right side of the screen, you can see sort of these labels that are all written by computer. So some of them are better than others, but the goal here is to basically give you a very short, absorbable snapshot of what you need to know about companies. So we see great utility in this in terms of the portfolios and understanding what's happening in the market, as well as in many cases like global macro situations where you're trying to understand and quickly summarize what's going on in maybe a dozen countries or more. It's just hard to do that in any other way. The 5th biggest trend I wanted to talk about was news automation. So we've been doing news automation for a long time. A number of other people do it. Typically, the way news automation works is it is what it sounds like. You use some data and it automates a story. So other organizations use this to produce automated sports stories or earnings stories about companies. That's when data comes in and it says the company earned this and that, and we do that as well. Where we have found particular use for automation this year and where we have increased our investment is around alternative data sets. So what was really fascinating about COVID was when it came out in March and April, a lot of people looked at the fundamental data, you know, the sort of traditional earnings and reports and so forth. And they said that data is not going to explain what's happening right now. And so we were quick to onboard new data sets. In this case, I'm showing 2 examples. One, the occupancy rates for offices in the UK, and the other one is for the number of people taking mass transit in New York area. We also brought in data sets on hospitalization rates and so forth. So once you onboard that data, it's available for people, but not discoverable. And so the insight we had was the ability to use automation was a way to make that data discoverable for financial professionals, because otherwise they wouldn't know we have it. And if we had it, they're not sure how they know how to find it. So this allows it to go right into their news feeds for topic areas they're interested in, whether that be healthcare or transportation or other things. Another example, which is really fascinating, is we're using automation to showcase anomalies in market activity. So these are things that you might pick up, and you could pick up, you know, if you're watching the screen, but you're not always watching the screen, and there's just a lot to watch these days. So an example here is on the left-hand side of the screen. I'm showing you that we published an automated story saying that LVMH on November 30th was seeing increased volume of social media postings and a surge in options activity. So we put those 2 things together. Basically, we've written scripts that say, watch for these kinds of unusual behavior. And you put it together, and the story is published automatically when certain thresholds are reached. And interestingly, like today, came out a story that said the stock is up and people are expecting the company to do better in the economic crisis. And we see this a lot. I'm not sure, you know, people start to focus on certain names, and then big news breaks. So whether they knew or what happened, don't know. But what we use this technology for is a way to clue people into what they need to focus on and think about. So I want to conclude by just kind of wrapping up where we think the industry is going, the financial news industry, and like how we think of it in terms of financial professionals. And the first is that you're going to have real-time access to vastly more content than you think about today. And this kind of happens incrementally. So it's one of those things you wake up and you look back and you're like, wow, I can't believe these are all the things I read. But what I'm telling you is that that 1.5 million stories that we carry, which is indicative of kind of financial information, that's going to continue to rise. There's going to be new and different kinds of text that you're going to have to grapple with. The second is that we will work on algorithms to really help you understand what's important in that ginormous volume of content. So it's interesting. Right now, we don't have an algorithm which detects what news is breaking. That's the kind of challenge we want to work on. Once you know, breaking news can be anything from a merger to something that Kim Kardashian is doing. So, when you think of breaking news, the first challenge with that from an engineering point of view is to determine what's new. The second challenge is to determine what's important and what would matter, what would be market moving. So we kind of tackle that in 2 stages. First, tell me what's happening that's new. And second, can we try and score that so that you know what's important? Finally, the next step, I talked about a little bit about translation programs that automatically translate content so that you can get access to all those sources and writers and all that information that right now is kind of beyond bounds or is only accessible if you speak the language. When you think about how trading floors operate, I remember certainly when I started out, you'd have people from all over the world on a trading floor, and if the story broke in Brazil, they'd yell out to the guy from Brazil to read the Portuguese language story. So this is all stuff that's gradually over time going to be handled by computers. And the opportunity is, it just opens up, a lot more to read. And then finally, what I was just referring to about alternative data and having more visibility on data and market anomalies and so forth via news automation. And all those things are things which I find a lot of people don't think about, but they're happening, and they are going to change the way all of us, work day to day. And with that, I want to end my sharing, and happy to take any questions. And I can just check the chat and see if anybody has anything they want to talk about. Let me see. Okay, hold on here. So the first question was, how do we find summarization on a topic on the terminal? So there's a couple of ways. The mnemonic, if you're familiar to Bloomberg, is NSTM. You can run NSTM and it launches a function, and you can type in any search there and it will generate summarization. And that capability is available in sort of throughout our panels and Launchpad features as well. And I think one of the things we think about summarization is not so much that it's an application, but it's engineering, and it's a kind of thing that once we've built it, we hope that we can embed that in many other areas of our system, so that it's not a question of you going somewhere to find a summary of an event or a summary of news, but that capability will be built into whatever screen you're on. So you can think a little bit of it like, if you saw the tweet I was showing you from Iran, one of the things Twitter has done, not in, fairly recently, is they've embedded translation capability in that tweet. So assuming you called up that tweet, you could hit a button and translate it. So we see summarization in kind of a similar vein, where it will be accessible and available to you, kind of where you need it in our system. So there's a question at the top, how do you approach bias in news coverage, and how do you work around the fact that you're restricted by the news partnerships you have, government censorship? So one thing I just would reiterate on that question. I mean, just a reminder, so I worked in the newsroom for many years. I do not currently work in the newsroom. So I work in the product group and am responsible for the content on the system, as well as how you find it, how we display it, and so forth. So some of that question might be better answered by the editorial people. I can tell you what I do oversee is the sources, the non-Bloomberg news sources that we put on the terminal. And we do select those manually. So Bloomberg is somewhat like a gated community, or I compare it, a better comparison I make is to Netflix, where Netflix has a model where they produce their own shows, and they also have other shows that are available from other sources. So we are similar, where we have news from Bloomberg News, and that's kind of our anchor, but then we have many other sources. In terms of how we approach those, we manually vet all of those. So if a source is problematic or has a lot of, as you said, fake news or bias or something, that there's a good chance we wouldn't include that, or we'd certainly have a good discussion about whether it's appropriate or not. We generally are going to err on the side of news that provides factual and important information. We will usually err on that side and try to include that. You asked about restricted news by partnerships. There's not really, the partnerships we have are things with like the New York Times or Washington Post. We're not really restricted by that. We tend to, what we're looking for there is to try to make accessible content to our customers. So it's not really, I mean, I guess you could say we choose the sources, but we try to choose sources that we think break news or that we think are viewed by, you know, a significant number of people. And so we've gone around the world. We have over 100 of those kind of partner deals. And what we'll typically do is look at a country and determine whether, you know, something like Le Monde, and we have half a dozen sources in France. So we have Le Monde, Les Echos, Le Figaro, so forth. So we'll try to look at the news we think that financial professionals will want to see the most. What do you see as risks to our democracy given social media disinformation? And the person says they saw the social dilemma. Yes, I saw the social dilemma as well. So I have a thought about that. It's a little unconventional, but my perception is that what's called or referred to as fake news or disinformation that you see on social media is more focused on the political sphere than on the financial sphere. You know, we just don't, you know, the kinds of stories that you hear about where people talk about certain things on social that seem crazy or unusual or unlikely. We tend not to see as many of those kinds of stories about companies and financial engagements. You don't see a lot of social media posts or news articles about mergers that never happened or never were going to happen. And I think that part of the reason for that is that there's a you know, a regulator in place in terms of the SEC, and they investigate stock manipulation and so forth. So that's potentially a crime. And then the other reason is that even if that news is published somewhere, when people have money on the line, they tend to investigate things before they do it. So we don't see a lot of that as a major problem in the financial arena. It's obviously pretty widespread in the political arena. And so I think that's kind of what I think about that. Can you talk to how information and news will be monetized? Many traditional news gathering organizations are on the edge financially, and not all news sources are created equal. That's a great question. So Bloomberg has the fortunate position that we provide news as part of a product that is for data analysis and general financial, you know, managing and trading your portfolio. So the news is a component, and I think it's an important component in the product, but it's not. It is part of the service we provide. It's not funded by itself. So other news organizations, I think what you're seeing increasingly is that they are putting up paywalls, and that the paywalls are, in the case of the New York Times, the Washington Post, they are charging, you know, both for advertising, but also charging people to subscribe. and they've seen in the past 4 years, a substantial increase in subscription revenue. And they're also doing things like conferences in some cases, or other events and podcasts and different things. So I think that's how they're doing it. I mean, I think the way I would think about that is that you're seeing kind of a concentration in the media, the way you see in many other industries. Whether that be automotive or what industry you're looking at. So big players like the New York Times and Washington Post have the funds to do the kinds of things they need to generate revenue. So I think that's what we're seeing. What would you recommend to most efficiently manage news flow for an equity portfolio on Bloomberg? So we have a lot of applications. So I guess if you are a Bloomberg customer, I would recommend you call your sales rep, because they can probably help you set that up or walk you through it. But it's an interesting question. Let me talk about it, because I think we do think that's a major problem. And it's a big problem because there's a lot of volume. We have a traditional tool where we allow you to look at the news flow and walk through and just see every news article about a company in your portfolio. So you basically take your portfolio, tie it to a news panel, and say anything that's tagged with your company gets put in there. And that we've had that in place for many years. And I think it works reasonably well, but it is challenged by a couple of things. I mean, one thing is, as the volume increases, what people want to do is to dial that flow up and down. And so we introduced a tool about a year ago. We call it's an algorithm, an AI algorithm called Importance. And what it allows you to do is to modulate the flow and the number of stories that you see based on how important they are. And it's a model that predicts importance. So it's something we're working on. But that'd be the first thing I would do. And then the second thing, which has been a problem for a long time, is that when people want news about companies and equities and news about an industry, oftentimes they want news about, let's say, the tech industry, but they also want major stories that might move the market that are not about the tech industry. So were there a major terrorist attack or a bombing or an explosion or an election or the Fed cuts rates, they typically want to see that in that flow as well. So we introduced a new product earlier this year that allows you to build a news filter. It allows you to build a news filter using technology that puts in all the articles about your companies or your topic, but also includes major articles we think you need to know about and that anybody would want to know about. So I'm going to type into there just for what that is. And again, I would reach out to your rep if you're not sure how to find that. Okay. Okay, let me see here. Have conversations evolved with news providers to incorporate them on your platform? For example, Wall Street Journal presumably sees themselves as a competitor to Bloomberg, but now are a news source for you. Yes. So what we try to do is, we want to provide the best coverage that we can. So again, a good example for that, I think, is really just look at the Netflix example. Netflix wants to make sure that in addition to Orange is the New Black, that you can also see The Office or Friends or Seinfeld or whatever else. Sometimes then, so what they do is they negotiate the price and the deal and the terms for that content. Sometimes it seems to make sense and sometimes it doesn't. And we're really no different. So we would provide every source we could. Sometimes the terms just don't make sense to us and sometimes they do. So we added the Wall Street Journal a year ago, and I guess the deal made sense for both sides, and it's been a tremendous addition to our platform because they break a lot of news. They're particularly strong in mergers, and we can see that in the response we've gotten from customers. They're really happy with that. He said, how do you think Bloomberg can differentiate itself on news going forward, and given the wide availability of news generally? I think that Bloomberg does differentiate itself. One of the things is we're very fast. The example I gave hopefully before, where we covered the COVID story in 5 minutes. I think both were fast and we're very global. So how do we differentiate? I don't know if there's anybody else who's got the footprint we do right now globally and the capability we do. I mean, New York Times is a great publication. They don't have people in, over 100 countries like we do. So our global footprint is very important. And I think that we're very fast. And then the other thing I think is we do stay focused on finance. That's our bread and butter. And that's what we excel at. Now we cover a lot of politics, we cover other things, but we think we try to cover that from a financial perspective and try to think about that, like how it's going to affect the markets and valuations for companies and so forth. So I think we try to stay focused on, in that way. As you expand, another question, as you expand content with different providers, can you speak to Bloomberg's vetting process in order to confirm that stories are real and accurate? That's a good question. So we do two things. The first thing, the most important thing, is we vet the source. So we have a review process where we look at sources when they come in and determine whether that source is appropriate. We also run algorithms that look at individual stories and flag them for objectionable content, and so forth. And we're just constantly reviewing that. We do get a lot of feedback from customers when they think sources are not appropriate or they are appropriate. And we just continue to add new sources and we continue to remove sources. So it's really a labor-intensive thing, but it's not something where we just forget about it. But it's very manual and it just continues. A question: do you think there may now be an issue of way too much info available on way too many websites? For sure, yeah. Does it create confusion more than clarity? Also, most important moves in markets are generated by uncomplicated factors, monetary policy, for example, that don't require the level of surgery we currently experience on most news coverage. I mean, I think is there too much information on websites? Yeah. I'm always amazed though, when you think about it from the other point of view, there's so much information out there, and yet people in the financial markets are very good at figuring out when things are not true. They are very good and very fast at figuring out when things matter because money's on the line. So I don't think we're going back to a world where there's fewer websites. And if anything, we're going in the other direction. I mean, where we're going to be, you look at all the information in Reddit, which is insane and very deep, but you have to know how to find it. As that becomes more accessible, again, what we're trying to do is give our customers access to the information they need, and then as many tools to sort of sort through it as possible. But absolutely, there's a lot of there's going to be a lot of effort where it's just you're still going to have to make decisions on that. So I don't think that's going to change. There's a question of what new product development. What is your process in deciding what new tools and features to prioritize? It's a great question. I mean, we have a fortunate situation is that our sales force is very engaged with our customers. They visit them, they call them, and we get feedback. We are, in many cases, we're an expensive system, and we're a crucial system for how customers run their business. So people call right away. If there's something they don't like about the Bloomberg or it doesn't work properly, we hear about it very quickly. We have a very effective system for the feedback that goes to our sales reps to be funneled to our product group. And then we assess when we get requests, we assess what it's going to cost and what it's going to take and how many people it'll help and so forth. But I can give you one example of this. I mean, I was the one who integrated Twitter into Bloomberg. And how did that happen? I got a call from a sales rep in London who said one of the major hedge funds had an issue. And so I went to London, I went to the customer, and we sat down. This is 8 years ago. And the CTO and the chief risk officer were complaining that their traders were trading off Twitter on the phone. And they said they can't have that. There's too much risk that they could be tweeting and so forth. So they said, you're a major vendor of information for us. Can you solve that problem? So that's kind of how our product development starts, is people ask us questions like that. And then I called Twitter and we figured out how to access tweets. We figured out how to integrate them in the system, and they became really something which you don't have to think about Twitter or know what it is. If you use it on Bloomberg, it's just information that comes in, it's accessible, and you can then do your job and think about whether it's important and trade off it. So that's kind of how we operate. We get a lot of feedback from our customers, a lot of feedback through sales, through Salesforce, and then we prioritize things. There's a question: are you looking to utilize different modalities such as audio to alert certain fast-moving or hard-hitting news? And how has your visual display of quantifiable info changed over the years? So we do have we do spend a lot and invest a lot in alerting, and you can set up audio alerts on the Bloomberg currently, and it's a large percentage of the news that's read on Bloomberg is read via alerts. So it's something we think about. The visual display, Bloomberg kind of looks like it's from 30 years ago with the black and amber. It's a classic look, but under the hood, it's very modern. It's so that has changed considerably. See if I missed some higher up. Question was, we're in an information age. There's an unlimited amount of news and data. How do you go about simplifying this process and not polluting your mind with too much information? I think, I don't know the answer to that, but I think that one of the things we want to try to build for people are the tools that allow you to access the highest quality, most important information. I think this is the challenge of the day. We're at the point where we can now access vastly more information than you can possibly manage. I mean, Apple alone has about 2,000 stories every day, so there's no way you can absorb all that. And really, what we're focused on is how can you better access that information and make it more efficient. I think it's not been solved. I think it's something we're still working on. There's just maybe one more, and then we're going to be at time. And do you anticipate another company could use these tools to provide sophisticated information that Bloomberg is providing to professionals more broadly and free or affordable? I think there are companies that do some things that Bloomberg does. I think what has been special about our company is our culture of continuous innovation, and we're going to continue to make it better. So I mean, I think also Bloomberg offers kind of a whole solution in a lot of ways, that you can get pieces of what we do from other platforms, but it's hard to get the whole package and have it the service as reliable and so forth. So that's, I mean, I think you can think of Bloomberg in that way a little bit like Apple. Like there's lots of people make phones. Apple's always making its phone better, and that's why. And you anticipate that. So that's why they're doing so well. I think we're about at time. I want to bring Chris back in, if he is there. There you go.
Hey, I'm here. Thanks, Ted. That's awesome. Thanks for a tour around the world. We don't. It's interesting to have a CFA charter holder who is a journalist by training, and then now is at a premier financial institution. So it's awesome to hear your stories and for you to share that with us. Thanks for our guests who attended. If you have any questions about today's event, please contact CFA Society Chicago office at info@cfachicago.org. And in closing, I do need to get a shout out to, you said sales rep, Ted. Your sales rep out here, Samantha, is outstanding. She's speaking of news and information sources, she's one of the most important people I speak with, because she knows what's going on the ground in Chicago with our members, with our membership. And so Even though she's in New York, she's valuable. She made this happen today. She got us Gina Martin Adams, another charter holder from the Bloomberg platform. So fascinating, Ted. Really appreciate you taking the time. And you're welcome at CFA Society Chicago to speak to our membership anytime.
Well, hopefully I'll come to visit you someday out there.
We can't wait. We can't wait. Thank you, sir.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.